Alright, okay. Hi everyone. Right, Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Thou album, Magus. This is the latest full-length album from Baton Rouge sludge and doom metal band Thou. I first covered the band's music back in 2010 when they released their breakout album Summit, a record that showed Thou to be one of the most exciting up-and-comers that sludge and doom had to offer. And even though Summit didn't make my favorite albums of the year list, it did offer 4 massive tracks with abrasive vocals and guitars, a massive and apocalyptic sound moving at a glacial pace, and outside of getting some heavier production and a larger presentation, Thou's sound has not changed all that much since then. Though their last full-length album Heathen pushed their sound to the limits of intrigue with a 75-minute runtime. An album that long is not necessarily a bad thing in theory, but I didn't really feel like Thou's sound and style was really so versatile that it was done any justice by being strung out to that length. Plus, their latest full-length LP over here is pretty much the same amount of time, stretched over nearly the same amount of tracks, and unfortunately the band hasn't really made their sound that much more interesting with an hour and 15 minutes of time to play with. I mean, there are some admirable things the band are doing this time around. Easily, Magus features the best production on any Thou album so far. Their very noisy and brittle take on sludge most definitely plays into a long line of artists from the Louisiana area who have done that very same thing, like I Hate God. The abrasive guitars and vocals on this thing, combined with the grand atmosphere the band presents, almost strikes a slight black metal tone at points on this record. I'm not saying it's an overt influence or an intentional reference, but merely an interesting similarity. The band are also doing a slightly better job of coloring these very slow, heavy riffs all over the album with some incredibly triumphant and tragic guitar melodies, some of the best of which turn up on the Changeling prints. Occasionally, the performances on this thing can be pretty crushing too, like the blaring and aggressively played guitar chords sync up really well with the bone-crushing drums on the Kingdom of Meaning. But despite all of these good things that Magus has to offer, I'm still at a point where I feel like Thou are stretching a somewhat one-dimensional sound very thin with these massive runtimes. I mean, the obvious need for a breather is very much addressed by the band with these kind of shorter interlude type tracks that pop in every once in a while that feature some softer, spacier tones, a lot of atmosphere, just to bring some kind of counterpoint to the endless and vast sludgescapes the band brings on most of the tracks here. And even though it is a nice touch, it doesn't change that I just feel this need for a bit more variation from tracks like Inward and Sovereign Self, both of which could have gotten a bulk of their ideas out in a much shorter runtime. Occasionally, the band will work in a soaring or shimmering guitar lead into their usual repertoire. Or even on Kingdom of Meaning I mentioned earlier, there's a clean vocal that pops in miraculously in the second leg, which was a really nice touch and did add to the likability of the track quite a bit. It's also worth noting the band does bring in some shots of feedback and roaring walls of guitar distortion to break up some of the monotony on the closing track, Supremacy, the last leg of which is a huge dissonant drone that certainly ends the album off with a bang. But still, on Magus, Thou's sound is not really all that dynamic, nor are their compositions so engaging that they're really worth eating up every second of. Which is not necessarily a bad thing for a band in the sludge or doom metal category, because there are plenty of groups in that genre that you can really just stew in their sound. I can sit and soak in a Dope Smoker. I can sit and soak in some Electric Wizard or a Satan-worshipping Doom. But I guess I just don't find Thou's sound so aesthetically appealing that I can just sit with it, without an attention-grabbing progression or a super aggressive performance. Because for the most part, Thou's sound is really too abrasive and harsh to feel cerebral or numbing, and yet the album wasn't consistently explosive and hard-hitting enough to feel visceral throughout for me either. This thing just sits in a weird middle ground that doesn't really scratch either itch for me significantly enough. Despite my complaints on this thing, I do think this is a likable album, and it is certainly fine while it's on, but there's not a whole lot about this thing that makes me want to come back to it outside of a couple tracks. The size of this record is pretty impressive. The production throughout is pretty nice. The performances are solid too. I'm feeling a light to decent 6 on this thing. Transition. Have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best. You're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another review for you to check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano. Music forever.